August 15, 1943, 4:30 a.m., Kiska Island. The Canadian soldier could not see more than a few yards ahead. Fog covered the beach. Fog covered the ridges. Fog covered the rocks, the gullies, the empty bunkers, and the slopes where every man expected Japanese machine guns to open fire at any second. The landing craft moved through cold water toward a shore that barely looked real. Not a tropical island, not palm trees, not sunlight. Kiska looked like the end of the world. Black volcanic ground, cold surf, a seat stone, a gray sky pressed low over the island like a lid, and somewhere beyond the fog. The enemy was supposed to be waiting. The Canadians had been told this island was occupied. They had been told the Japanese were dug in. They had been told to expect caves, mines, snipers, hidden guns, and sudden violence from places no man could see until it was already too late. So when the ramp dropped, every movement became dangerous, every shape looked alive. A rock became a helmet, a ridge became a firing position, a shadow became a man. The soldiers moved forward slowly, rifles raised, boots slipping on wet ground. No one wanted to stand too tall. No one wanted to be first across open ground. No one wanted to mistake silence for safety. They were not cowards. They were soldiers who had been trained to understand what hesitation could cost. In war, a second can decide whether a man lives. In island warfare, a cave mouth could hide a machine gun. A ridge could hide an observer. A bunker could seem abandoned until it was not. The enemy did not need to be visible to be terrifying. He only needed to be possible. That was Kiska's first weapon, possibility. The men listened, for a shot, for a shout, for the first crack of a Japanese rifle, for machine gun fire cutting through the fog. But nothing came. Only wind, only surf, only the sound of men breathing through fear. The silence did not comfort them. It made everything worse, because silence on a battlefield is never empty at first. It feels like something waiting, something watching, something choosing the right moment. The Canadians had landed expecting an enemy. And in their minds, the enemy was still everywhere. In the fog, behind the rocks, inside the empty bunkers, above them on ridges they could barely see. But the first terrible thing about Kiska was not the gunfire. It was the silence, because the Japanese soldiers they had come to fight were already gone, and yet the island would still find ways to kill. Operation Cottage was supposed to be an invasion, a real one. Thousands of Allied troops, landing craft, warships, aircraft, artillery. Careful planning, nervous men waiting for the moment when the fog would lift just enough to reveal the enemy. Canadian and American soldiers had not come to Kiska expecting an empty island. They had come expecting the next brutal chapter in the North Pacific War. The question was not whether the Japanese would fight. The question was how badly. Would they fire from ridges? Would they wait in caves? Would they pull the Canadians inland and then strike from hidden positions? Would the beach itself be mined? Would the bunkers be abandoned, or only pretending to be abandoned? Every question pointed toward danger, and that is what made Kiska so strange, because by the time the landing force came ashore, the Japanese garrison had already slipped away. Verify exact evacuation date and number of troops. But the landing troops did not fully understand that yet. For them, the battle was still alive, still loaded, still waiting to begin. This is where Kiska becomes more than a military oddity. It becomes a psychological story, because war does not happen only in front of the eyes. It happens inside expectation, inside training, inside intelligence reports, inside memories of what the enemy has done somewhere else. A soldier who believes a bunker may contain a machine gun behaves differently from a man walking past an empty building. A patrol that believes snipers are watching every ridge moves differently from men walking through empty hills. A unit expecting ambush hears the world differently. A stone rolling downhill becomes movement. A branch snapping becomes warning. A figure in the mist becomes enemy before it becomes human. The Japanese were gone, but their expected presence remained. That expected presence shaped every step. Every shouted warning, every nervous trigger finger, every movement through fog, every decision made by men who could not see far enough to be certain. And certainty is one of the first things war takes from people. Kiska was not dangerous because it produced a great clash of armies. It was dangerous because soldiers acted under the belief that a great clash could begin at any moment. This was the central paradox. How do you clear an island when the enemy is gone, but every man still believes he might be there? How do you avoid panic when silence itself feels like a trap? How do you prevent confusion when every unit is moving through fog, expecting sudden death? How do you tell soldiers trained to survive ambushes that the absence of gunfire means nothing yet? Operation Cottage became a battlefield of assumption, not a battle against Japanese infantry in the conventional sense, but a battle against mines, terrain, weather, incomplete intelligence, fear, and the mental shape of an enemy who had disappeared. The Japanese did not need to fire a shot to remain present. Their silence had already entered the battlefield. And once it was there, it was hard to remove. Canadian soldiers knew what visible danger looked like. At Dieppe, danger came from cliffs, beaches, concrete, machine guns, and German fire tearing into men with nowhere to hide. At Normandy, danger came from fortified positions, artillery, mines, mortars, and the terrible knowledge that the enemy could see you before you could reach him. At the Scheldt, danger came from mud, water, causeways, flooded fields, and German defenders using the terrain like a weapon. Those battles were horrific, but they made a kind of military sense. There was an enemy. There was fire. There was ground to take. There was a visible reason men were dying. Kiska was different. On Kiska, Canadian soldiers landed into fear without confirmation. They had no clear front line, no obvious battlefield rhythm, no enemy muzzle flashes, no advancing Japanese counterattack, no shouted commands from the other side, only fog, rocks, ridges, empty positions, and the terrible suspicion that the silence was hiding something. This was not the fear of what soldiers could see. It was the fear of what they could not see. A man can point his rifle toward a machine gun nest. He can crawl away from artillery. He can identify a ridge where enemy fire is coming from. But how does he fight uncertainty? How does he fight a battlefield where every shadow may be nothing or everything? How does he calm his own nerves when every story he has heard about Japanese island defense tells him that silence may only mean the enemy is waiting? That was why Kiska belongs in a different category of Canadian war memory. It was not a defeat like Dieppe, not a massive assault like Normandy, not a grinding mud campaign like the Scheldt, not a prisoner tragedy like Hong Kong. It was something stranger. A military operation where the enemy had vanished, but the fear he created stayed behind. The Japanese had occupied the island. The Allies had prepared to retake it. The Canadians had trained themselves to expect danger in every cave, trench, ridge, and hollow. And by the time they landed, those expectations were still alive, even if the enemy was not there. This is what made Kiska so psychologically dangerous. The island did not need to be full of soldiers to feel occupied. It only needed enough traces of them: a bunker, a tunnel, a helmet, a ration tin, a dugout, a footprint in mud that might be old or might not be. The mind fills gaps quickly when death may be hiding inside them. The Germans had feared Canadian infantry because they kept advancing through fire. The Japanese were expected to be feared because they fought from hidden positions and often resisted with terrifying determination. But Kiska was different because Canadian soldiers landed ready to fight an enemy who had already left. And still the island turned deadly. The strangest Canadian battle of World War II was not strange because nothing happened. It was strange because fear kept fighting after the enemy was gone. Before the Canadians landed on Kiska, before the fog swallowed their patrols, before an empty island became one of the strangest Canadian battlefields of the Second World War, there was the Aleutian chain, a long broken line of islands stretching west from Alaska into the North Pacific. Cold, remote, wind-blasted, covered in fog so thick that distance itself seemed to disappear. This was not the Pacific War most people imagine. Not jungle heat, not palm trees, not coral beaches, not sunlight burning over blue water. The Aleutians were different. Black rock, gray sea, volcanic slopes, rain that soaked into uniforms and stayed there. wind that cut through wool and bone, fog that could erase a mountain, a ship, or an entire enemy force. For the Japanese, the Aleutians were a strange frontier, far from the main Pacific battles, far from Tokyo, far from the warm island campaigns that would later dominate the war. But in 1942, Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska, and that fact carried enormous psychological weight, because these were not distant islands in the South Pacific. These were part of the North American war zone. Belied planners, and it meant Japan had placed troops on territory that pointed toward Alaska. It meant the North Pacific could no longer be ignored. It meant maps that once seemed empty now had enemy flags on them. Kiska became a name that sounded remote, but dangerous. An island wrapped in fog, occupied by Japanese troops, fortified against attack, and difficult to observe clearly. The geography itself protected it. Reconnaissance could be limited by weather. Bombing could be frustrated by cloud and mist. Naval movement was punished by rough seas. Troops preparing for invasion had to imagine the battlefield more than see it, and imagination is dangerous in war. Because when men cannot clearly see the enemy, they often build him larger in the mind. The Japanese garrison on Kiska was isolated, but isolation did not make it harmless. An isolated defender can become more dangerous if he is dug in. A cave can become a fortress. A ridge can become an observation post. A bunker can become a killing point. A narrow beach can become a trap. And the men planning Operation Cottage knew that the Japanese had already shown, across the Pacific, that they could make island warfare brutal, slow, and costly. Kiska did not have to be large to be frightening. It only had to be uncertain. For Canadian soldiers of the 13th Canadian Infantry Brigade Group, this would be a different kind of war. They were not landing in France, not moving through European farms, not fighting in towns of stone and church towers. They were entering a landscape that looked almost alien, a northern island where fog could turn a platoon into shadows, where sound carried strangely across wet rock, where a man could hear movement and not know whether it was another Canadian, an American, a gull loose stones, or the enemy. That is what made the Aleutians so psychologically oppressive. The battlefield did not announce itself. It concealed itself. A soldier could not trust his eyes, could not trust distance, could not trust silence. And on Kiska, silence was never neutral. It suggested patience, ambush, observation, a hidden enemy waiting for the first mistake. The Japanese had occupied the island. The Allies had bombed it. The invasion force was coming. Every military instinct told the Canadians that men were waiting in the fog. That was the Aleutian nightmare. Not simply that the enemy was there, but that no one could know exactly where. May 1943. Attu Island before Kiska there was Attu Atoll, and Attu taught the Allies a lesson they could not easily forget. The terrain was brutal. The weather was miserable. The fighting was close, exhausting, and costly. American forces had landed expecting a difficult operation and found a Japanese defense shaped by cold, mountains, fog, and desperation. Attu was not a famous battlefield like Normandy, not a name repeated in every school book, but for the men preparing to invade Kiska, Attu mattered deeply. It was proof that the Japanese would fight in the Aleutians, proof that the weather could be as dangerous as the defender, proof that a remote island could swallow men in fog, cold, rock, and confusion. The soldiers did not need myths. They had a recent example, and that example was enough. At Attu, Japanese resistance had not followed the clean logic of a European battlefield. There were no neat front lines, no obvious city to capture and declare finished. The defenders used terrain, ridges, hollows, concealed positions, sudden close fighting, and the island itself helped them. Fog could hide movement. Cold could weaken men. Wet ground could exhaust soldiers before bullets ever reached them. Visibility could vanish. Units could lose orientation. A man could climb toward what he thought was empty ground and discover too late that someone had been waiting there. This was what the Canadians carried with them into Operation Cottage. Not direct memory for every man, but operational memory. The memory of what had just happened nearby. The knowledge that Japanese defenders in the Aleutians had not simply disappeared when pressured. They had fought, they had died, they had made the island costly. So when planners looked at Kiska, they did not see an empty problem on a map. They saw another Attu, another landing, another island full of hidden positions, another place where fog might conceal men willing to fight until the last possible moment. That fear was not irrational. It was based on what the Allies thought they knew. Japanese island defense had already gained a reputation for being difficult, tenacious, and often deadly. The Canadians and Americans expected not surrender, but resistance, not open negotiation, but ambush, not silence, but sudden fire. And that expectation shaped everything. The way soldiers held rifles, the way officers planned routes, the way patrols would later move across the island, the way men interpreted every noise in the fog. This is one of the most important parts of the Kiska story. The soldiers were not foolish for being afraid. They were not absurd for expecting death. They had every reason to believe the Japanese were waiting. Attu had taught them that the Aleutians could bleed men badly, and the Pacific War had already taught them that island fighting could become savage in ways few soldiers ever forgot. So, when the landing craft moved toward Kiska, the Canadians were not entering a mystery with calm minds. They were entering the shadow of Attu. Every rock on Kiska already carried a warning. Every bunker already carried a possibility. Every cave already carried a memory of what had happened on another island. The enemy had not yet appeared, but in the mind of the landing force, he was already there. Late July 1943, Kiska Island. While Allied planners prepared for invasion, while Canadian and American troops trained for a fight, while aircraft bombed, ships watched, and intelligence tried to understand the island through fog and distance, the Japanese made a different decision. They would not wait to be destroyed. They would leave. The Japanese garrison on Kiska was isolated. The island was under pressure. Allied power was growing around it. The nearby Battle of Attu had shown what could happen if an island garrison was trapped and forced into a final defense. Kiska could become another grave. So Japanese command chose evacuation, not surrender, not a final stand, not the dramatic last battle the Allies expected. Evacuation, quiet, careful, hidden by fog. The Aleutian weather that had tormented Allied reconnaissance now became a shield. Fog covered the sea, fog covered movement, fog blurred certainty. And under that cover, Japanese forces slipped away from the island. The Allies still believed they would have to storm. This was not cowardice, it was survival. The Japanese did not need to die on Kiska to make the Allies pay a price. Their absence would do that later. When the evacuation was complete, Kiska did not suddenly look harmless. That was the genius and the cruelty of the situation. The island still looked occupied. Bunkers remained. Defensive positions remained. Dugouts remained. Equipment and traces of human presence remained. A soldier landing there would not see a clean, peaceful place. He would see evidence. Evidence that the enemy had been there. Evidence that someone had prepared to fight. Evidence that every empty position might still be part of a trap, and the Allies did not fully understand what had happened. In time to stop the invasion, verify wording based on intelligence debate, that uncertainty became fatal, because war punishes uncertainty. If commanders assume the enemy is gone and he is not, men die. If commanders assume the enemy remains and he is gone, men can still die. This is the trap of incomplete intelligence. Every decision carries danger. Every interpretation can become lethal. The Japanese had vanished physically, but psychologically, they remained on Kiska. They remained in the Allied plan. They remained in the minds of Canadian soldiers, waiting offshore. They remained in every warning about mines, caves, snipers, and hidden guns. They remained in the memory of Attu. They remained in the fog. And when the Canadians landed, they would not land on an empty island in their own minds. They would land on an island filled with an enemy they had been trained to expect. That is what made Kiska so strange. The Japanese did not need to fire. They did not need to counterattack. They did not need to appear by leaving without being fully understood. They turned the entire island into a question. and soldiers would have to move through that question with loaded rifles. August 15, 1943, Kiska Island, Operation Cottage began in fog. Not the kind of fog that simply softened the horizon. This fog swallowed distance. It turned ridges into shadows. It erased the difference between rock and movement. It made an entire invasion force feel as if it were stepping into a room where someone might already be waiting with a rifle raised. Canadian and American troops came ashore expecting resistance. They expected Japanese guns, Japanese snipers, Japanese cave positions, Japanese counterattacks. They expected a beach that might turn violent in seconds. The men did not know they were landing after the enemy had already left, so they behaved like men entering danger, because to them, danger was everywhere. The first moments were not heroic. They were tense, slow, uncertain. Men crouched low and moved forward through mist. Officers tried to keep units together. Voices were kept controlled. Orders were repeated through wind and surf. The island gave back almost nothing. No machine gun bursts, no mortar fire, no shouting from Japanese positions, no sudden counterattack from the heights. Only fog, only silence, only the sound of Allied troops moving carefully through a place they had been told would fight back, and that silence created a new fear. If the Japanese were not firing now, were they waiting? If the beach was quiet, was the ambush farther inland? If the bunker seemed empty, was it actually empty? Or had someone stayed behind to let the Canadians pass before opening fire from the rear? This is how fear works in combat. It does not wait for proof. It fills empty space. It turns silence into intention. It turns absence into strategy. Canadian soldiers moved through gullies, rocks, wet ground, and abandoned positions with the caution of men who expected death from every side. A trench could be empty. A trench could also contain a grenade. A hut could be deserted. A hut could also be wired. A ridge could be nothing. A ridge could also hide an observer, calling fire down through the fog. The island was not giving answers quickly, and in war, not knowing can be almost as dangerous as being shot at. Some men must have felt the strangeness immediately. The lack of contact, the lack of fire, the lack of bodies in fighting positions, but no one could simply relax. Not yet. The Japanese had built a reputation for fighting from concealment, for using terrain, for waiting, for turning caves, hills, and bunkers into killing spaces. The Canadians were not walking through an empty field at home. They were walking through an enemy island, or at least, an island that still felt enemy. Every step carried the weight of a two. Every warning from training returned. Watch the ridges. Watch the caves. Watch your flanks. Do not bunch up. Do not assume anything is safe. Do not trust silence. That last command may have been the most important. Do not trust silence. Because on Kiska, silence did not feel like peace. It felt like a trap holding its breath. The Canadians had landed into a battlefield without a visible opponent, but psychologically, the battle had already begun. Men reacted to sounds, to shadows, to movement at the edge of sight, to their own expectations. A shape in the fog could be Japanese. A sound behind a ridge could be a patrol. A sudden shout could mean contact or confusion. The men were inside a combat environment built almost entirely from uncertainty, and this is where Operation Cottage became something more disturbing than an ordinary invasion. If Japanese soldiers had opened fire, the Canadians would have understood the situation. Terrible, but understandable. Enemy ahead, return fire, move, survive. But Kiska offered no such clarity. It gave them fear without confirmation, danger without direction, a battlefield where the enemy existed first in imagination, then in every possible hiding place. They had trained for combat. They had prepared for ambush. They had expected death, but they had not prepared for an island that refused to tell them whether the war was still there. And so the soldiers kept moving, into fog, into silence, into abandoned Japanese ground, still waiting for the first shot. An empty battlefield should feel safe. That is what logic says. No enemy, no gunfire, no counterattack, no machine guns waiting on the ridge. But Kiska was not safe, because the island was not empty in the way peace is empty. It was empty in the way a trap can be empty. until someone steps inside it. Canadian and American troops moved across ground that had been occupied, fortified, bombed, watched, abandoned, and feared. The Japanese were gone, but traces of them remained. Mines, possible booby traps, dugouts, bunkers, equipment, paths that might lead somewhere dangerous, positions that looked too quiet to trust. And all around it, fog. Fog thick enough to turn friendly movement into threat. Fog thick enough to break units apart. Fog thick enough to make men see what they feared. This is where Kiska became deadly. Not because Japanese soldiers were firing from every cave. They were not. Not because a great battle erupted across the island. It did not. But because thousands of armed men were moving through hostile terrain, believing the enemy might still be close. That belief shaped every action, every trigger finger, every shouted warning, every decision made through fog and exhaustion. War had trained these soldiers to react quickly. But on Kiska, quick reaction could become disaster. A sound in the fog could be an enemy patrol, or an Allied patrol. A figure on a ridge could be Japanese, or Canadian, or American. A shot fired in confusion could bring more shots in reply. A unit hearing gunfire could assume contact and prepare for battle. A warning could spread faster than truth. This was not cowardice. It was the logic of men trained to survive. But survival training depends on recognizing danger, and Kiska made danger unclear. Friendly fire became one of the nightmares of the operation. Verify specific incidents and units. In thick fog, with multiple Allied forces operating across difficult ground, identification could fail. Men who had come to fight the Japanese could find themselves threatened by confusion among their own side. That is one of the ugliest forms of battlefield tragedy. Not enemy fire, not heroic sacrifice, but misrecognition. Fear moving faster than certainty. Weapons answering shadows. Mines and leftover hazards also remained part of the danger. Verify mine booby trap details. An abandoned position could still kill. A path through enemy ground could still hide explosives. A bunker with no defenders could still feel dangerous because no soldier knew that what might be inside it. The Japanese did not need to be present for their occupation to leave behind risk. The island remembered them in metal, wire, and warning. And then there were accidents. Terrain, weather, poor visibility, exhaustion, wet ground, steep slopes, loose volcanic rock, weapons carried under stress, machines operating in terrible conditions. The island itself seemed to grind against the invasion force. Men had come prepared for a visible enemy. Instead, they were fighting environment, expectation, and confusion. This is why Kiska must not be treated as a joke. It is easy to say afterward. They invaded an empty island. It sounds absurd, almost comic. But it was not comic to the men walking through fog with loaded rifles, convinced they might be killed at any moment. It was not comic to those who were wounded. It was not comic to those who died. It was not comic to families who received news from a battle where the enemy had already gone. The tragedy of Kiska is that fear remained operational after the enemy disappeared. The Japanese had left. But the expectation of Japanese resistance still controlled the battlefield. It controlled how men moved, how they listened, how they aimed, how they interpreted silence, and perhaps most dangerously, how they interpreted one another. The island still killed because war had already entered the minds of the soldiers who landed there. And once war enters the mind, an empty ridge does not look empty. A quiet bunker does not feel safe. A shadow is not just a shadow. It is a decision waiting to happen. Kiska did not look like a place men were meant to fight over. It looked like a place the world had almost forgotten. A cold island in the North Pacific, wrapped in fog, beaten by wind, cut by ridges, gullies, wet slopes, and black volcanic ground. There was no warmth in it, no comfort, no sense that a soldier could ever fully belong there. For Canadian soldiers, the island was disorienting from the beginning. The fog collapsed distance. A hill that seemed close could vanish. A patrol only yards away could disappear into mist. A voice could carry strangely through wet air. A rock could become a crouching figure. A bunker could appear suddenly, dark and silent, as if it had been waiting there all along. This was not a battlefield that revealed itself. It concealed itself. The ground made everything worse. Wet, uneven, volcanic, difficult to read. Every step demanded attention. A man could not simply move forward and watch for the enemy at the same time. He had to watch the ground beneath him, the ridge above him, the fog around him, the soldier beside him, the dark opening ahead. A battlefield like that exhausts the mind before it exhausts the body. Cold rain worked into uniforms. Wind cut through exposed ridges. Men carried weapons, ammunition, gear, fear, and uncertainty across ground that offered no emotional relief. In France or Belgium, a soldier might see a village, a church tower, a road, a field. Familiar shapes, European shapes, but Kiska felt alien. A North Pacific island of fog and silence, where even abandoned positions seemed alive with threat. The island also punished communication. In fog and broken terrain, units could lose orientation. Signals could be misunderstood. Movement could become scattered. A command given clearly in one place could arrive confused in another, and the fear of Japanese defenders made every mistake sharper. If a unit was late, was it delayed by terrain or ambushed? If firing started, was it enemy contact or confusion? If a patrol vanished into fog, had it simply moved beyond sight? Or had the island swallowed it? This is what made Kiska the worst kind of battlefield for perception. It gave soldiers too little information and too much imagination, too little visibility and too many possible threats, too few answers, and too many memories of what Japanese island defense could become. The island did not need to lie. It only needed to hide. That is why the phrase, "the island at the end of the world," feels appropriate. Because to many men landing there, Kiska must have felt removed from every ordinary idea of war. Not a battlefield of flags and clear objectives. Not a battlefield of obvious enemy lines, but a place where weather, terrain, fear, and silence merged until the island itself seemed hostile. The Japanese were gone, but Kiska remained, cold, silent, difficult, dangerous. The enemy had vanished, but the battlefield had not. And in that fog, Canadian soldiers learned that sometimes the worst terrain is not the ground beneath your feet, but the uncertainty around you. After the landing, after the fog, after the patrols moved through empty Japanese positions, the real shape of Kiska began to appear. The island had not been defended, not in the way the Allies expected. The garrison was gone. The enemy Canadian and American soldiers had prepared to fight, had already escaped into the North Pacific fog before the invasion began. And suddenly, Operation Cottage became one of the strangest military questions of the war. How had so much force been sent against an enemy who was no longer there? The answer was not simple. War rarely gives commanders clean information. Reconnaissance can be wrong. Weather can hide movement. Reports can be incomplete. Bombardment can create false confidence. Silence can be misread. And in the Aleutians, fog could turn intelligence into guesswork. The Allies knew Kiska had been occupied. They knew Japanese forces had defended Attu with deadly determination. They knew an invasion against a dug-in garrison could become brutal. So planners prepared for the dangerous possibility, not for the easy one. That is the cruel logic of command. If you assume the enemy is gone, and he is not, men die on the beach. If you assume the enemy is still there, and he is gone, men may still die in the fog. Kiska lived inside that uncertainty. The Japanese evacuation had succeeded, not only because ships carried men away, but because the Allies still had to behave as if those men might be waiting. The Japanese did not need to fire from the ridges. The idea of Japanese defenders had already taken position there. This is why Kiska cannot be understood only as an intelligence failure, though intelligence uncertainty was at the heart of it. Verify exact wording based on official reports. It was also a failure of perception under impossible conditions. Allied forces were trying to read an island that refused to reveal itself. Aircraft could pass overhead and see little through weather. Ships could bombard positions and still not know what remained inside them. Observers could study signs of activity, but in fog, distance, and war, signs can deceive. An empty camp can look recently occupied. A quiet bunker can look patient. A missing patrol can become evidence of hidden danger. From the Japanese perspective, the evacuation was a different kind of victory, not a victory of conquest, not a victory of holding ground, a victory of escape. They avoided destruction. They denied the Allies the battle they had prepared for. They left behind an island, filled with enough evidence of occupation to keep fear alive, empty positions, possible hazards, defensive works, the shape of an enemy without the enemy itself. For Canadian soldiers, on the ground, none of this mattered in the first moments. They were not reading the operation from a history book. They were not standing safely after the fact, counting mistakes, and asking why commanders believed what they believed. They were inside the fog. They were moving with rifles raised. They were trying to survive according to the information they had been given. That is important, because Kiska is easy to mock from a distance. It is harder to mock when you imagine standing on that island, unable to see, waiting for a machine gun to open from a bunker. Everyone told you was occupied. The deeper lessons were not simply that the enemy had escaped. It was that war can make absence dangerous. A missing enemy can shape plans. A silent enemy can shape fear. A vanished enemy can still direct movement, trigger reactions, and cause casualties through the assumptions left behind. The Japanese were no longer physically on the island, but they remained operationally present, in the Allied plan, in the briefing rooms, in the warnings given to soldiers, in the memory of Attu, in the fear of caves, ridges, and ambushes. This was the intelligence problem at Kiska. Not only what the Allies did not know, but what they believed they knew strongly enough to send men into the mist. And when soldiers carry belief into fog, belief can become as dangerous as enemy fire. At some point, the truth became impossible to ignore. The Japanese were gone. The bunkers were empty. The ridges were silent. The caves held no final defenders waiting for the last shot. The enemy Canadian soldiers had prepared to face had vanished before they arrived, and yet the operation had not been harmless. Imagine that moment for the men on Kiska. For hours, perhaps days, they had moved through fear. They had watched every ridge, checked every hollow, stared into every dark opening, heard danger in every sound, expected death from every place the fog refused to reveal. Then slowly, the realization settled. There would be no great Japanese counterattack, no final stand, no hidden army waiting inland, no enemy force to defeat in the way the invasion had imagined. Only empty positions, and the cost of believing they were not empty. Relief must have come first for some. Relief that the beach had not become a slaughterhouse. Relief that the ridges had not opened fire. Relief that Kiska had not become another Attu. But relief does not erase confusion, or anger, or grief, because men had still been wounded, men had still died. Verify exact casualty figures. Families would still receive telegrams. Units would still count losses. And soldiers would still remember the terrible strangeness of risking death on an island where the enemy had already escaped. This is why Kiska should not be treated like a joke. The phrase sounds almost absurd, an invasion of an empty island. But to the soldiers who landed there, it was never absurd. They did not know it was empty. They did not know whether the next bunker would fire. They did not know whether the next shadow would move. They did not know whether silence meant safety or ambush. War is lived forward. History is read backward. And the difference between those two positions is everything. The men on Kiska were not fighting nothing because they were foolish. They were fighting the possibility of something. That possibility had been built by intelligence reports, recent experience, Japanese reputation, the memory of Attu, the terrain, the fog, and every warning soldiers had received before landing. Their fear made sense. Their caution made sense. Their tension made sense. What made Kiska strange was that the world around them did not answer in the expected way. A normal battle gives soldiers an enemy to focus on, a muzzle flash, a trench line, a fortified house, a tank, a ridge. Kiska gave them uncertainty, and uncertainty is difficult to fight because it does not stand still. It moves with you. If you enter a bunker, uncertainty waits in the next room. If you cross a ridge, uncertainty waits in the fog below. If no one fires, uncertainty whispers that the enemy is waiting for better range. If a shot rings out, uncertainty asks whether it came from the enemy or from someone as frightened as you are. That was the battlefield against nothing. Not empty, not safe, not meaningless, a battlefield built from expectation. And when the Japanese disappeared, they left behind something almost as powerful as resistance. They left behind a question every soldier had to answer with his nerves, his training, and his weapon. Is someone still there? For Canadian soldiers, Kiska became a memory unlike the others. Not because it was the bloodiest, it was not. Not because it was the greatest victory, it was not. But because it exposed something haunting about combat. Sometimes the mind keeps fighting after the enemy is gone. And times, that is enough to kill. Return to the bunker, the dark opening in the ridge, the wet ground, the fog moving slowly across the entrance, the silence inside. At first, it looks like nothing, an abandoned position, a relic of an enemy already gone, a piece of war left behind on a cold island in the North Pacific. But for the Canadian soldier approaching it in August 1943, it was not nothing. It was possibility. Possibility is what made Kiska dangerous. The possibility of a machine gun, the possibility of a sniper, the possibility of a mine, the possibility of a Japanese soldier waiting, in darkness, for one clean shot. And every man who landed there had been trained to respect that possibility, because men who ignore danger in war often do not live long enough to be corrected. This is why Kiska matters. Not because it was a great Canadian victory in the usual sense. Not because the island was taken in a dramatic battle. Not because Canadian soldiers stormed through enemy fire and broke a final defense. Kiska matters because it reveals a stranger truth. War does not only kill through bullets fired by the enemy. It kills through fear, through confusion, through weather, through bad information, through assumptions that feel reasonable in the moment and tragic afterward. The Canadians who landed there were not fools. They were soldiers entering a place they had every reason to fear. They carried the memory of a coup. They carried warnings about Japanese resistance. They carried the weight of an operation planned against an enemy believed to be waiting. And when they found silence instead of fire, that silence did not instantly become peace. It became another kind of battlefield. The Japanese vanished, but the war stayed behind in the fog, in the abandoned bunkers, in the mines and hazards, in the minds of men who could not know what waited beyond the next ridge. That is what makes Kiska one of the strangest Canadian battles of World War II. The enemy had gone, but fear remained, and in war, fear can still pull the trigger. The strangest Canadian battle of World War II was not strange because nothing happened. It was strange because fear kept fighting after the enemy was gone.